Max Solensky. I'm a game preservationist who specializes in Japanese feature phones, also referred to as Keitai. And today I will be speaking about just that, from Keitai games to their historical significance and to their preservation efforts. And yes, recording is okay for this presentation, so feel free to take pictures or videos of everything I'm going to talk about. So first, what exactly is Keitai? Well, Keitai is a common shorthand for Keitai Denwa, which in Japanese broadly means mobile phone. This means it can apply to early flip phones all the way up to modern smartphones. But in this sect of game preservation, we use Keitai to specifically refer to Japanese feature phones. These were devices that were released in the early to late 2000s, so their Western equivalents would be like flip phones or dumb phones. But as you'll soon see, Keitai were far superior both inside and out. So where did Keitai come from? Well, in order to answer that, we have to go back to the 1990s, where Japan really lagged behind in the adoption of personal computers. In fact, by the end of the 20th century, less than 30% of Japanese households had a personal computer, compared to over 50% of American households at that same time. This meant that Japan's internet penetration was very low, because the main way of accessing the internet back then was through a personal computer. And meanwhile, the US was going through the dot-com boom, an internet renaissance, if you may. But in contrast with the rest of the world, handheld mobile devices were growing increasingly popular in Japan, especially among younger generations. It started with the pager, which was originally in the business sector. They slowly trickled out into consumers' hands in the early 1990s, and young people started to use it as a popular way of communicating with each other, like pager codes, which were numbers that corresponded to popular Japanese phrases. And then they customized their pager. For example, you see here a Hello Kitty pager. And then came the personal handy phone system device in the mid-1990s, which was like a cordless cell phone with a very limited calling range. And those two, the younger generation seized upon them, decorating them with stickers and keychains. So Keitai, just like the pager, emerged from the business sector in the mid-1990s. But popular adoption truly didn't explode until major telecom carrier NTT Docomo launched iMode in 1999. It was the world's first mobile internet service, predating American networks like AT&T and Verizon by a number of years. And the impact of iMode cannot be understated, because only 2 years after its launch, well over 70% of Keitai users were connected to the internet, whether it be through iMode or a competing service like KDDI's EasyWeb. And compare that to how at that same time, less than 10% of Americans even had mobile internet capabilities on their cell phone in the first place. And all of a sudden, Japan's internet penetration problem was a thing of the past. Instead of being brought to them through personal computers, it was being brought to them through Keitai. And it forged a new internet niche that was seen nowhere else in the world at the time. But why was iMode so popular? Well, there are many reasons, but one academic calls it an internet constructed by telecommunications people. But what does that mean? Well, basically Docomo took their existing telephone payment structure and they applied it to the new realm of mobile internet. This meant that you would pay a monthly fee to access iMode, but then if you wanted to access other internet content like sports scores or stocks, you'd pay an extra fee on top of that. This meant that iMode and its competitor Keitai services were limited by design in order to maximize revenue. So where do video games come into any of this? Well, video game publishers created these storefronts on these Keitai internet services, but you couldn't just connect to one of them and buy one game. These were subscription-based storefronts, meaning that by paying a monthly fee, you could download not just games, but wallpapers and ringtones, meaning that really appealed to that Keitai youth subculture, which was obsessed with decorating their phones. But this subscription-based distribution method also allowed for some gaming experiences that were pretty novel at the time. You could have episodic releases where your game would receive new content every single month. Your game could always be connected to the internet. And there were even limited time releases, since these were entirely digital after all. I have a humorous example here. This is Sonic Golf C-Mode Cup, and it was released for about a month in 2002 for iMode. And basically, if you played this game when it was active, you could receive points that you could then spend at a real-life Coca-Cola vending machine, meaning that if you played Sonic Golf, you could get yourself a free Coke. But then also Keitai had these very powerful chipsets that allowed for some very impressive three-dimensional graphics. This game right here is a Gundam game that was preloaded on a SoftBank Keitai in 2006. That's pretty impressive. That's like PSP levels of graphics and performance. But if there's one game that really made the most of its unique hardware, it has to be Wildland, which was developed for a single Keitai called the F-04B. And I actually have one right here to demonstrate for you all. So the F-04B, it has a touchscreen, but then it also has a keypad. But the phone itself can also break into two parts, with the second half having a QWERTY keyboard and function keys. And both halves have an accelerometer and a gyrometer and microphones. And what do you do with all of this? Well, Wildland is a survival game, but in order to survive the longest, you have to do a bunch of motion control mini games. So for that tree mini game, if you want to make yourself a shelter, you have to swing this half left and right in order to chop down the tree. And yes, there is a fishing mini game. You tap where you want to cast your rod on here, and then you just cast it like this, and then you take it out like this. And this half also gets tilted, like if you want to hunt, for example, you can just tilt this to aim and then go like this. So it's incredibly convoluted, but it just goes to show how Keitai really did make the most of its hardware. But what are some more normal games, you might be asking? Well, there are so many of them that I can't even list them in one presentation. So I'm just going to give you the best hits. So Mega Man received a bajillion entries on Keitai, but one that's my personal favorite is Rockman Dash Great Adventure on 5 Islands. It's an original entry in the cult classic Mega Man Legends series. And for those who don't know, this was the first three-dimensional Mega Man series that was released on the original PlayStation. And it's kind of the epitome of that low-poly 90s aesthetic, where you've got the blocky models, but the very expressive facial textures that change when the characters are speaking. And as you can see, not much was lost in the conversion to Keitai. You still have those textures, and you can platform and circle strafe in 3D. You can upgrade weapons, and there are even side quests. Pokemon also got an entry, actually developed by Square Enix. It's called Pokemate, and it's a virtual pet simulator, so not too dissimilar from Pokemon Go, where you're collecting and cultivating your Pokemon, but it's also a messaging application, meaning that your Pokemon can deliver messages to other players, but you can also send your Pokemon as well. I guess the first mission was a prequel to Persona 3, and just like 5 Islands, it has real-time three-dimensional combat and some very impressive three-dimensional graphics. And as you'll soon see, Square Enix was a very, very big supporter of Keitai. But did you know that they actually made an exclusive RPG for iMode? It was called Monotone, and it told the story of a boy who brings color to a grayscale world. And notably, all of the game's side quests, monster designs, and character designs were actually decided by fans. Because of that Keitai internet storefront, people could submit their designs to the developers, vote on them, and then the following month, that new content would be implemented into the game. Once again, a big benefit of that subscription-based distribution model. But if there's one game that I really want to highlight in particular, it is Before Crisis Final Fantasy VII. It was the first prequel to the groundbreaking PlayStation 1 RPG Final Fantasy VII. And the fact that Square Enix decided to put the first prequel to one of the biggest RPGs of all time on Keitai shows how much confidence they had in the platform. And like other RPGs, Before Crisis has a very long and convoluted story, But thanks to that subscription-based distribution model, each story chapters were released monthly over the course of 2 whole years. So there were 24 chapters in total. And the game itself was also specifically designed around your Keitai. Emailing was extremely popular on Keitai in the early 2000s, so you could email your magic spells and summons to your friends. You could use your phone's camera to take a picture of an object, and the predominant color would determine what magic spell was generated for you. And there were even carrier-specific characters, meaning if I played the game on iMode, I would have access to one character, but if I was on a competing easy web service, I'd have a different character. And there was even real-time online multiplayer, presented through a side app based off of the gold saucer location from the original Final Fantasy VII. But all of these features were enabled by the fast Keitai internet speeds. And as a result, the game was heavily reliant on streaming data from Square Enix's servers. Very little of the game was stored in your Keitai. In fact, your phone could only store one map at a time. So if you wanted to switch out of any mode, you'd have to reconnect to the server and download it again. Even your save data was on Square Enix's servers, meaning you had cloud saves in 2004. Extremely impressive. So that brings us to the fall of Keitai games. Why didn't Keitai take effect outside of Japan? Many academics have many different theories, but one prevailing one is called the Galapagos effect, where a hyper-focus on a domestic market will compromise a technology's international vitality. And Keitai were simply too designed specifically for a Japanese market. They used network standards that were not compatible overseas. And in addition, they had features like electronic wallets that weren't really used outside of Japan at the time. Nobody was paying for the subway using their mobile phone. And Keitai games themselves were just too reliant on their hardware and their networks. Before Crisis was actually going to be released overseas, but it was canceled because American network speeds just could not catch up with the amount of data that it was streaming. And those three-dimensional Keitai games, like the Gundam one or Rockman Dash 5 Islands, they just struggled to run on the less sophisticated Western chipsets on those feature phones. And by the early 2010s, smartphones had just eclipsed Keitai, in part due to the App Store and the Google Play Store. Those are universal storefronts where you can just download games and applications. And all of a sudden, the concept of a subscription-based distribution model just wasn't very appealing to consumers anymore. And by 2021, all Keitai game storefronts were delisted and closed, sending thousands of games into obscurity. So this brings us to the modern day, Keitai game preservation. And there are a lot of difficulties associated with it. For one, most of these games, only being released in Japan, have never been re-released, meaning that they are stuck on aging Keitai hardware. Once the phones are gone, the games are gone. And that means that they are extremely difficult to find. And oftentimes, preservationists have to resort to buying junk lots off of auction sites and hoping that the owner did not wipe their data on there, which is like playing gotcha for Keitai games. It's not very fun. Then there are a lot of software and hardware challenges because Keitai used a lot of proprietary NAND chips and custom file systems with little to no documentation online since they were just developed for Keitai and only Keitai. And as you can see in that photo, it's not very fun to dismantle one of these phones either because they're so small and they're so delicately put together. And there are also emulation challenges because each telecom carrier used a different platform to run its game on. And sometimes they would use something like J2ME or Brew, but then they would have a custom API on top of it, making it not compatible with existing J2ME or Brew emulators. And like before Crisis, there were other games that were very reliant on a server, not just for getting new content, but just for the game to really exist in the first place. Like, for example, Final Fantasy IV, the After Years, was released in a chapter format, but every time you wanted to switch a chapter or even exit out of a big dungeon, you had to download the new map from Square Enix's servers, meaning that even if you have one copy, it's probably just a partial one. And the games themselves, the histories behind them, also have very little documentation since they're just left on Japanese press releases and videos that are just being delisted as time goes on from the internet. But it's not all doom and gloom, because there have been a ton of preservation successes in the past 3 years. For one, there is something that we like to call the deep mode cable method, developed by users named XYZ and U. And basically, if you take a regular Docomo charging cable, one half is a USB and the other half is like a charging port, and you modify the pins on that charging port end and plug it into a phone without the battery, the phone boots into a developer testing mode. And this allows us, with some custom Linux scripts, to basically make it dump all of its internal firmware. Not just games, but the ringtones and the wallpapers as well. And this is a great breakthrough because it is non-destructive. As you saw in that other photo, it's not fun to take apart these phones. So if you could just plug something in and just have your data, that's ideal. And if you're a Japanese user who wants to preserve their memories off of their Keitai, the last thing you want to see is your personal device with all your memories being shredded in front of your eyes. But that's just for Docomo phones. KDDI phones have it much harder. And that's where the work of some users, like this one named Craze, comes in, where they have to manually find and read these JTAG pins. And as you see, it's really tedious and it's really labor intensive. It's not fun at all, but somehow they're so motivated to do it that they're able to find ways, and eventually I think about 10 or 12 KDDI phones are dumpable now, but some still have troubles because their memory was split into 2 different banks and the user data isn't accessible. So there's still more challenges, but it's still a great breakthrough. And with regards to emulators, currently there are very few of them. Luckily for Docomo games, we do have Docomo's official SDK, but that was meant for stationary applications, and therefore it runs 3-dimensional games horribly, and it has a lot of sound emulation problems. But luckily, there are some emulators in development. There's one called Squirrel JME by Stephanie Gawariski, and they are doing great work on developing basically a giant Java micro edition emulator that also supports Docomo Java games. And Easy Web Games have it tougher because there's only a single emulator out there called Melange, but that is also making more progress as more games get preserved from that service. But most exciting, recently, there was a partial copy of Before Crisis that was preserved by a user going by Naoya Shinoda. And unfortunately, this game was one of the hardest to emulate because it's so reliant on its servers. In fact, before you even get to the title screen of the game requests no less than 6 different types of data. So that's very difficult, but luckily a user who goes by UV was able to make a local server, basically tricking the game into connecting into what it thinks is a Square Enix server. And I'm happy to say that a lot of the functionality for Before Crisis has been restored, including its battle system like this. This is a training mode battle. And it's also not turn-based either, it is real-time 3D combat. Extremely impressive stuff. And then on the history side of things, there is Keitai Wiki, which is actually founded by Ellen, who's in the crowd right now. Basically, it's a centralized place for compiling Keitai game history, from press releases to articles to commercials, because as time goes on, all of this stuff will eventually be lost to time on the internet, because it's so old and it's only in Japanese. So this has become a very valuable resource for just accessing information about these games that would be very hard to find otherwise. But we've also been forging relationships with different preservation organizations. The Game Preservation Society is a nonprofit that is headquartered in Tokyo. And before the iMode website shut down in November of 2021, they downloaded over 800 iMode games. And currently, they are working with a select few fan preservationists, including myself, to help them find a way to get the games off of their phone so they can decide on what to do to catalog them in the future. And I'm happy to say that right now, things are going extremely smoothly with them, and I expect to have some great progress within the next year. And also, we've been doing some great advocacy work with the nonprofit HitSave. We've been doing podcasts, and I've been writing update articles for them. And they were one of the first organizations to be open to giving us a platform to speak on. So I could confidently say that if it was not for HitSave, I probably would not be speaking up here today. And as a result of all of these efforts, over 200 Keitai games are now preserved, including actually every single game that I've shown you in this presentation, with the exception of Monotone, have been at least partially preserved today. And that is a massive achievement, but it's also important to remember that there's still more work to be done. Thousands of Keitai games are still lost to time. We're picking up the digital breadcrumbs, so to say. And we also need to find more Keitai game stories, because the server-dependent games, the only way to know how they function is through video recordings of the past or talking to Japanese users who happen to play them. And I think that's one initiative that we'll definitely start working on in the next year. But we also want to establish more connections with other game preservation institutions and organizations, because we really want to formalize Keitai games into the greater scope of video game history. So what really is the takeaway, and why should any of you be caring about these funny Japanese flip phone games? Well, I believe that Keitai games were the precursors to modern mobile games, and they were also a cultural touchstone in Japan. They were more than just a geographic fact, and they are certainly more than just dumb phone games. The server-based Keitai games were the first live service mobile games. And in fact, they were reliant on servers because the telecom carriers like Docomo encouraged the game publishers to do so, because Docomo would make more money, but then they would give the game publishers a bigger chunk of their profit. And modern live service games also have that same kind of constant supply of content and daily or weekly releases. And some modern game distribution services are also similar to that Keitai distribution model. Xbox Game Pass comes to mind, where you pay a monthly fee to access a set of impermanent digital games. But of course, that is vulnerable and really just impermanent. They will eventually be delisted, and they will eventually suffer the fate of these Keitai games. And that's why I believe that Keitai games are a perfect vessel to start a conversation on preserving modern mobile games. Because the challenges of today are going to be the challenges of tomorrow. And some of it's already happening now. Early iOS and Android games are already being delisted and lost to time. But that's not to say that it's all doom and gloom, because the existence of this conference gives me hope. You know, I'm surrounded by people that have so many different ideas and solutions for these problems. And yeah, I really believe that there will definitely be solutions in the future. Because digital games can be saved from the corridors of time. It's just a matter of when. So that wraps up my presentation. If you would like to contact me or just learn more about these games in general, my contact information is up there. I have a feeling some of you might recognize my online pseudonym, because I'm really a big guy talking about it online. But then if you also want to get involved, there is keitaiwiki.com. If you want to learn more about the games themselves, or also just get involved in the game preservation community itself. You don't need to be a technical mastermind to help. If you know of a Keitai game that is not already archived or documented, feel free to let us know and make an entry on keitaiwiki.com. We would love to have you. So thank you to the Strong for allowing me to speak here today, and thanks to all of you for showing up to listen to me. It means a lot. Thank you.
For questions.
What's the most interesting thing you found on a Keitai phone?
In terms of games or
Just
like anything? We found some unsavory content, but that's the risk that comes with getting the games via auction sites. You never know what's going to be on there. But I guess just, I don't know. There's so many great games. I mean, for one, this is one of my personal favorites, that Wildland. I did like a 3-hour long play of it, and I hurt my right arm doing it. It hurts to swing it like that. But I just say, really, all the three-dimensional games, I think is just incredible how they were able to put that on like an early 2000s cell phone. Like, is it even possible to put it on there? And they did it. So yeah, that's it. That's my answer.
Can I add to that?
Sure, yeah.
Some of the other things that we found on the phones that I think are interesting are a lot of pictures of displays at anime conventions or of different displays in general of anime characters. I'm forgetting the names, but One Piece is a big one a lot of stuff that you don't see them online, like they have these museums and stuff, but they might have had displays here or there, and I see that pretty often in all these photos.
Thank you.
Yeah, so it goes beyond the games too. There are parts on there on the phones. Also, like maybe ringtones as well. Like you hear conversions of popular songs into a ringtone. So like, I think there's a Bee Gees song that was preloaded on one of the phones, and just hearing that in MIDI format is just kind of fun to do.
Secretary characters. There's these things called a machichara, which are like assistants that walk around on your phone, but they're different characters. And the main character is this butler sheet, but you could also download other characters. We had one phone where we found 3 characters from Natalia, and we just had France walking around on her phone, just saying random stuff. Professor Layden came pre-installed on one of the phones. So Professor Layden would let you know if you got phone calls, if you got emails, would remind you of your friends' birthdays, and also let you know about general notices, environmental notices, things like that.
Any more questions?